3 other acts that ticked off the colonists. There was the sugar, stamp, and Townsend duties. All 3 of those raised the ire of colonists, but none provoked the kind of widespread backlash that the Tea Act provoked. I think this story is important because it shows that the beginning of the American experiment was not just a revolt against taxation, not just a revolt against taxation without representation. It was a revolt against inequitable taxation and privilege. It was a revolt against government bestowing particular rules for some, but not for others. Okay, so now let's bring it forward to the other Tea Party. I've spent some time looking at both Tea Party websites and Occupy Wall Street websites. And the interesting thing is, despite the ideological miles that separate these 2 groups, there are some interesting points of commonality. As you all probably know, both groups are vociferously opposed to the bailouts of large banks. Both of them see it as cronyism at its worst. Both of them see it as a taxpayer bailout of the very people who were most responsible for the financial crisis of 2008. And both of them see it as a redistribution from median or average income people to the wealthy. So let's get to some studies of this. We actually know a little bit more about the bailouts now that economists have had a chance to look at it. A recent study looked at the several hundred firms that received TARP funds. And what they found is, after you control for a number of other factors, that 3 things emerge. The firms that engaged in more politics, meaning more intensive lobbying and more political activity, were A, more likely to receive TARP funding, B, received a larger amount of TARP funding, and C, received the funding sooner than those who didn't play politics. If you want to get precise, and they actually did, every dollar invested in political activity in the 5 years prior to TARP translated into $480 to $580 in TARP funds. So at the heart of these 2 stories is firms, banks, or government-sponsored enterprises that have privilege and power and access to politicians along this street, many of them, and go into politicians' offices and ask for favors or privileges. Politicians turn around and give them favors or privileges. This is a very, very significant problem for a democracy and an economy. So I would say it's quite obviously a problem for a democracy because it smacks of corruption. But it also has a problem for an economy. It undermines growth. There's actually really good studies that have shown that the firms that ask for privilege tend to be, it's kind of bizarre. They actually take more risks, and yet they tend to innovate less. So they innovate in exactly the wrong way that we want them to, but not take risks, but not in a way that is likely to benefit their customers. But it also undermines long-run growth. It turns out that countries that have a lot of stability in their major firms tend to grow much slower than other countries that have the Schumpeterian process of creative destruction, where the top firms change a lot over time. And I would also argue that it undermines short-run macroeconomic stability. Of course, the financial crisis was in large part brought about because politicians substituted their preferences for that of consumers. And every time a politician substitutes his preference for that of consumers, you set up a problem where you have to have a major readjustment. So think about the last 10 years. For 10 years, systematically, the federal government and some state governments encouraged people and capital to flow into housing and finance to an extent much greater than customers in those industries wanted. And an adjustment had to happen. And when that adjustment happened, it was very painful. Now, you could look pre-2008 and say, oh, they're encouraging people to go into housing and finance, and they're encouraging capital to go into housing and finance, and this is bad for customers. It's great for the banks, great for the builders, and maybe the costs outweigh the benefits, but, who cares? Well, post-2008, we know that it wasn't just bad for customers and that the costs of the customers outweigh the benefits of the entrenched interests. It was even bad for the guys in housing and finance. Because when you lure somebody into an industry that's not sustainable, you lure somebody into a job, tell them to acquire human capital in an industry that doesn't serve customers' needs, you're not serving their interests either. Okay, so what do we do about it? Well, this is not as I mentioned, it's not a brand new problem. And it's a problem actually Madison himself wrestled with. So I'm going to quote from the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10, the best Federalist. So he talked about faction. This is interest groups, but it's a 19th century word for interest groups is faction. And he said it's a major problem with the Republic. And there's basically two ways that you can deal with it. On the one hand, you can remove the causes of faction by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. Well, thankfully, Madison was pretty quick to set aside that idea. His point is you can regulate out the interests. You can try to control all the interests and say, don't let them ask government for favors. But he said that's going to destroy the liberty that is essential to a free society. He dismissed that. His second solution is to control its effects. So make sure that special interests don't have power to influence policy. Or they don't have power, they might have power to ask, the privileges aren't bestowed. So the simplest way I would think about this is that the problem is not that corporations go to government and ask for favors. It's that government grants favors. P.J. O'Rourke says, when legislators determine who buys and sells, the first thing bought and sold is legislators. So the reason you don't take the first route of outlawing, of saying you can't engage in politics, not only, in my view, and I think we're going to hear more about this later, not only is this destructive of liberty, it undermines the most important communication, but political communication, the most important for free speech, but political free speech. But it also isn't going to help. Water flows downhill. As long as government has a sign out that says, privileges here, we're going to grant privileges. We're going to give you a special tax break, a subsidy, a regulation that benefits you but harms your competitors. We're going to give you a no-bid contract. We're going to give you a monopoly license. Anytime government has a sign out that says that, people are going to show up and ask for the privileges, right? If you try to say, oh, and also we have another new regulation, you can't talk. You can't ask for privileges. You can't talk to your elected officials. A, that undermines liberty, but B, it's not going to work. As I said, water always flows downhill. Businesses are going to find a way to ask for special favors so long as they're being granted. That's all I have to say.